This is Changeling the Podcast. Welcome to Changeling the Podcast, where history is a matter of opinion, but only the most nonsensical ones. I'm your host, Pooka, and I am joined by fellow historian Fetch. Greetings, Fetch.
Greetings, Pooka, and hello to our fellow time travelers joining us on this adventure into the dark history of the Chronicles of Darkness.
I'd like to start this episode with a brief personal anecdote, if I may. Back in high school, one of my favorite teachers was my British literature teacher. She was like a life mentor and family friend eventually. And at one point, I remember her railing about the English textbook that she was supposed to be teaching from. And in the teacher's edition, there was this introductory thing where they said, on the first day of class, take a paper plate, draw a clock face on it, and paste it to your door. As the students come in, if they don't notice the paper plate, draw their attention to it. Once everyone is settled in, tell them that literature is a form of time machine, and in this class we will be traveling through time through the power of books. As she just tore that page out of the teacher's edition and tore it to shreds.
Good.
But yeah, that kind of, patronizing approach to time travel is not what we are here for today. We are respectable and well-informed temporal voyagers, I guess.
We're here for fun with our time travel stories, and I'm happy to say, so is this book.
Yeah, fun that starts with one of the most gruesome, bleak periods of human history.
Why must you undermine me like this?
Anyway, so yes, today we are starting our journey through the first set of Dark Eras, the historical modules that were released for the New World of Darkness / well, really by this point, the Chronicles of Darkness. It had fully transitioned by this point. So I guess first and foremost, what is your perspective on that shift in terms of the setting? Like when I say, okay, this is solid Chronicles of Darkness, what does that mean? Because we've talked about the rules changes, we've talked about some of the differing approaches to narrative, but how does this being Chronicles rather than New World of Darkness, I guess, affect the experience of the game, in your opinion?
God's in his heaven, all is wrong with the world. The God Machine is now a central figure of the Chronicles of Darkness mythos and will show up in the corners of its game lines if you look long enough. I personally love the God Machine, and I know some people who absolutely despise it, but it adds some sort of fun backbone you can choose to use for the supernatural of your games. It also has a bit more of, I'm looking for words here to describe it.
I was going to say creepiness, but...
More creepy? You think the Chronicles version is creepier than the first edition?
A little bit, in the sense that the foundational world is a little bit creepier and uncanny, even for mortals, more than in the first edition. The other piece that I've been thinking about is each splat feels less like a template pasted onto a mortal base, even if that's still how the character building works to some extent, and more like its own thing. And so they're all circulating in this world. Part of that being they have the advantage of having built up some lore, some setting material, etc. at this point, so there's a more solid grounding. That's just me, though.
I tend to think of streamlined.
Okay.
That's typically what I feel about from Chronicles of Darkness. Everything is much more streamlined.
That's fair. And the realities of publishing by this point, because now we're up to 2014 when they started working on the Dark Eras, and the situation around the IP as it was being sold off, I imagine they, to some extent, had to get more concise with the material, because each line got fewer books in the second edition. And maybe more of this will shake out when we directly compare the second edition Lost Book to the first. So, musings. Sometimes I have them. Anyway, Dark Eras. So yes, these came after the God Machine updates. The central conceit is they're these smaller modules that cover a variety of historical moments around the world, each one covering one or two, I think in a couple instances, 3 game lines. because of the timing, some of these will be first edition, some second edition. It's kind of mid update. And it's not SAS content because there are only sketches for possible stories, setting material rather than a prepackaged game. Kind of like if we took just the first half of Victorian Lost. I also didn't know before reading up on this that these had gone through more of an open development process, with the core offerings being written in response to feedback from fans and Kickstarter supporters. Some of them were expanded, new ones were added. Eventually, it was enough of a thing that we got 3 full books out of the project. Large books. So this one is how many hundreds of pages? So there's something like 40 Dark Eras total, and there were another, I don't know, 15 stretch goal ones that never made it to print.
There's even more of this content than what you're seeing here. The Seed of the Dark Eras started with New Wave Requiem,
Yes.
a setting book for running Vampire the Requiem in the 1980s. People liked that well enough that they then released a second one. I believe the next one was
Mage
Mage
Noir.
Noir. I think Victorian Lost was the third. However, Vampire the Requiem got its own pair of 2 books for exploring dark eras of vampiric history. And I believe that those predate the book that we are reading now.
I got the sense that a lot of these were passion projects for the authors. And I mean, I'm fully in support of passion projects, obviously, but I wonder, there were a few of these I flipped through and I was thinking, like, who asked for this?
I agree with you. I think that some of them were also written because everybody felt like it had to be written. For example, we have a game called Promethean, which is about playing Frankenstein's monsters, and we know that canonically Frankenstein existed. Well, if you're going to have a book called Dark Eras, you gotta have the time of Frankenstein.
The year without a summer.
Yes, which is a cool concept. Like, it's completely clouded over for the entire year. It's cold, dark, spooky. But I don't remember getting any joy from reading that other than like the, hey, it's Adam, cool.
Do you know if that one talks about the eruption of Mount Tambora?
Yes, in fact, I believe that's the key event of the Year Without a Summer.
Nice. Yeah, see, this is good for me because being a history nerd who loves factoids, I come across these things and I'm like, yes, there it is. Were there any other non-Lost Dark Eras that you think are particularly noteworthy? Because we are going to focus on the Lost ones, obviously.
Oh, certainly. Just keeping to this book, I have to point out The Sundered World, which takes place a few decades after the prehistory of the World of Darkness gets destroyed. The beautiful utopia of mages gets sundered and history gets rewritten, so now it's the Neolithic era. And you play as Neolithic mages and werewolves. It's fantastic because they change the setting so that you have the border marches for werewolves instead of the rigid gauntlet. There's still the Bane against Silver, but Father Wolf is still around, and they say, well, it's actually just because werewolves are wrong. Sorry.
How about that?
Yeah, it's certainly a fun read. I'm fond of After the Fall just because it's it's Beneath the Skin is the one I'm thinking of. I love ancient Mesoamerican history, and that is a cool era for doing that. Fallen Blossoms is great.
Yeah,
That is
I liked that one.
just after the Sengoku era, and it's about Edo era Japan. The Supernatural, I think it's that the Supernatural officially does not exist. Monster hunters are kind of a big thing, but they're kept like active in secret because there's a big thing about keeping the pretense of the peace. And it's an era where the monsters are now going, well, okay, if you say everybody has to pretend to be all nice and peaceful and that monsters don't exist, I guess we'll just try to hang out with humans and see how that goes. But my absolute favorite is A Handful of Dust, a setting which I have run, which is Prometheans during the Dust Bowl era. It inspired me to actually read and watch material about the Dust Bowl and become a much better informed person and run one of my best campaigns.
Does that include Carnival?
Yes. Season 1 of Carnival, in fact.
My favorite Dust Bowl era media. The one that I wish we had gotten, which was a stretch goal that I think didn't appear, is Jazz Age Requiem. Someone did actually release Jazz Age Masquerade recently on the Storyteller's Vault, Bram Clark and some other folks. But
Yes, I've seen that.
So all that said, we are going to be proceeding through the modules that involve first edition Changeling the Lost contained within this first book, moving in chronological order, with a bit more time dedicated to the ones that are entirely lost content. So for today, we're covering Three Kingdoms of Darkness for Changeling and Geist, and Requiem for Regina for Changeling and Vampire. But before that, we have an introduction with... I have two sections in particular from the introduction that I want to call out. Actually, I think it's really just those two sections. But so, although the book acknowledges that playing in historical settings is a thing gamers are interested in doing, it doesn't really get into why. And obviously, this is going to differ by table. Some groups are interested in history as it unfolded, others want to rewrite it. Some want the role playing challenge of that alternate space, and others are curious just how a given splat would operate under different circumstances. But even though they don't talk about that, there are these really nice reminders about accuracy and sensitivity. So, with accuracy, each module contains enough historical detail for the purpose of grasping the content. The intro points out, though, that they aren't meant to be exhaustive and to change what you want. With sensitivity, they point out that historical realities and traumas are things that you need to think about and talk about with your players before diving in. This is largely how you'll know what you need to change in the first place. I'm on board with the idea that fun is more important than accuracy, and you don't need to hit every detail to give an authentic feel for a setting. But I do kind of question. They have a little bit of a hand wavy take that history, I think they say, history deserves only as much respect as makes for a good story. I would urge storytellers to think about the consequences of any changes that they make to the setting and make that part of the conversation with players. So I don't know, do you think that this is good advice overall? Would you supplement that with anything?
Yes, I think that the advice is good. I maybe would have phrased it differently to
Mhm.
account for your point, so I didn't sound like I was being flippant to the importance of historical accuracy. I do, however, think that when running a game, it is very important to put at the forefront what are my players and myself excited about seeing. Do we want to have the Christmas truce last for a day, a week, 2 weeks, the duration of the campaign that we're running in this World War I era? Whatever seems right. Oh god, I didn't mention that there's a whole World War I era in here for Prometheans and Senators.
Mm.
Another really good setting that I've run. I love exploring things like that, so I recommend that readers use these as touch points for their own stories. But also, if you're going to set a game in a historical era in the first place, look for what makes that historical era interesting and touching. I really had my heartstrings pulled by a story of, I think it was a couple of Jewish tailors who sold suits to folks in the Midwest.
Mm.
And when the Dust Bowl hit, people naturally, their clothes got torn through, and they made a habit of driving out to New York to get bunches of new suits and bring them back and
Mm.
sell them for a little cost or give them away, I think, to people for as many years as they could. And I had them feature in one of my sessions of Promethean because that is a uniquely touching moment from that point of history. I took the idea of these hospitals that sprung up in the era that became the last bastions for people who were struggling through an apocalypse, and I put a vampire at the center of it and raised some questions over, humanity, need for survival. The center of it, though, was always that there was something good and hopeful in here, and it's not something that I could
Mm.
easily replicate in the modern day. So please look for those opportunities if you're going to run these eras and
Yeah.
adapt them in a way that you find that speaks to you.
That's the thing that I would encourage people to read more historical books, because you get these moments of people and individuals and events that aren't part of the broad strokes. Like if you say, what was the Dust Bowl? You can talk about the climactic conditions, you can talk about the farming industry and everything, but it doesn't tell you, like, what was the experience of a mother of six trying to make ends meet as her house was falling apart around her in that context, you know? And I think those are for me at least, that's what draws me to playing historical games, is the particular configuration of history and culture and emotion that happens in that place and time. That's something which, on the one hand, is very unfamiliar, and on the other hand, ties into things that you can summon up in yourself and change your perspective to understand as a modern person. And you won't necessarily get that from, I'll just go on Wikipedia and look up the details, or I'll just watch this movie. Like, dig a little. I forget, wasn't it like Victorian Lost or something? There was a book that had an actually really solid just page of, hey, we know you're all going to do internet research. Here's how to approach it correctly. And it was just like a nice distillation of that. But anyway,
I don't recall which book that was, but
it was
yeah,
somewhere.
I
Yeah.
recommend that all readers of this book begin by reading what a chapter has to say, then go to the bibliography
Hmm. Hmm.
and check out that material to find more. If you already like what you're reading, it's great for getting more detail. It's also a good idea if you are like, look, I want to run to the strongest. This era set in about mages in the time of Alexander the Great, but what do I do with all of that? Read the books. If you're vibing with it, you'll figure it out.
The second part of this introduction that's worth calling out is we get extensive reworking of certain skills, which we discussed a bit with the Mirrors book. There are notes about replacing firearms with archery, drive with ride, computers with enigmas, and enigmas has lots of other really interesting implications, like using it to figure out complex systems, including social ones.
Enigmas is one of my favorites and arguably should have just always been there. It's a skill that players might remember from the original World of Darkness
Yeah,
books.
it's a core thing there. I mean, there are also these general notes about how things like academics and medicine and science will look different in other settings. All of it seems pretty good, and I, for one, am totally here for Sumerian streetwise. So, anything to add from the introduction before we jump into the first module?
That I do recommend reading these sections about these skills thoroughly for the eras that you are interested in, as it has some fun implications and good subsystems. You are, of course, welcome to use as little of it as you really want to, or to even come up with your own stuff. But by all means, please use this as a basis.
Yep.
Oh, and don't forget, it's very easy to get confused about what era is which. The introduction has a great section covering exactly that.
All right, so let's jump into Three Kingdoms of Darkness. This module takes us to the Three Kingdoms era of 3rd century China, so called because, in the wake of the collapse of the Han Dynasty, that being one of the golden ages of Chinese history, there were three main states vying for control of the region. There were famines, much violence, disorder, and devastation, but it's also one of the most mythologized periods of Chinese history. Even Magic the Gathering had an expansion based on this period, so that tells you something. This is largely due to the very popular 14th century text Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is described in the sidebar here. So it was a very essentially mythologized historical novel that has shaped understanding of the era to the present day. There are three themes for this module. First is Mandate of Heaven, which they broaden from a political doctrine of rulership into a more general fate slash destiny slash karmic thing about how one acts or doesn't in accordance with the design of the gods. This is important in the context of the second theme, Heroes in the War, where each soldier, human or supernatural, wants to have a lasting impact, whether a virtuous one or not. And lastly, I would rather betray the world is derived from a quote whose second half is, than to have the world betray me. This is survival by any means necessary and all of the moral consequences therein. And the three of those tie into the mood of war on an epic scale. Because, seriously, there's all this hardship with the barest glimmer of hope. The closing bit says, All of this is the mandate of heaven, a test the people must pass to set things right and return to a state of true peace in China once more. And I do feel putting this all together makes a story that's worth exploring in other eras too. Like, you can easily backport those themes and that mood into modern times or other historical settings, even if the details will look very different. So, in this context, and knowing that this is a cross between Geist the Sin Eaters and Changeling the Lost, what are our expectations, I guess, for what this will look like going in? I was sort of thinking, I want to see Geists who embody some culturally or historically specific concepts, and Lost Endurance is framed by this narrative, as well as like how changelings of this era conceive of what's happened to them. I'm setting myself up to be disappointed, but what were your thoughts, I guess, going in?
Oh gosh, I was excited to read about the way that both sin eaters and changelings have to interface with an entire nation that is dealing with a massive war that changes everything. The idea of what does war do to these supernatural communities, including things like, most prominently, ghosts. I'd say also I was just generally excited about the opportunity for heroism in the setting. Like the idea they emphasize people being like have a chance to really be heroes is very off key from what you get out of a typical role of darkness presentation of your role as a supernatural being in things. So
Yeah.
can your changelings pull themselves out of their difficult situation and be the heroes that the community needs? That's a fascinating question. I'd love to see that. Sure. Let's go for that.
Yeah, it is a fascinating question. I don't know that we get a proper answer, but I guess they tilt at it. So very briefly, I do want to give just like a few words of history with the caveat that this is 1800 years ago and the records are couched in legend, but for the edification of all. Basically, the Han emperors needed help to suppress an uprising called the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which lasted 21 years, by the end of which the emperor had lost a lot of power to local warlords. The three states in particular are Wei, also called Cao Wei, Shu Han, and Wu. Apologies in advance if I'm getting the tones wrong. I'm doing my best here. The noteworthy figures of the era included Dong Zhuo, a warlord known for his atrocities as the Han dynasty collapsed, Cao Cao, a crafty military strategist who gets demonized in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and the three Han loyalists who fought against him, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Jiang Fei. According to legend, these three generals swore an oath of mutual loyalty called the Oath of the Peach Garden. And I'm like, hey, oaths, changeling. But anyway. There's a bunch of other folks, but the upshot is that there's this back and forth of crucial battles, shifting alliances, sons inheriting grudges from fathers, diplomacy, treachery, drama, everybody struggling to be the final victor. And even though it's the three kingdoms, there were dozens of little states rising and falling, because this is over the course of decades, until at last the Sima family of southern China was able to secure the throne, albeit tenuously, and begin the Jin dynasty. Your mileage may vary for how much detail you want to include from that, but the important piece is that you have these larger than life characters in the spheres of military and politics, around whom momentous things happen which affect hundreds of thousands of people at a time. So giving either player or storyteller characters that kind of centripetal force is one choice, or you can zoom in on the everyday lives of the people and make it, quote, street level, if we want to call it that. And they do provide some good sidebars around this. So, apart from like the broad strokes of history, we get details about the hardships faced by peasants, such as famines and disease. They point to a largely patriarchal and agricultural setup of the society within this imperial system rife with corruption. And despite all that, this cultural self assurance that their way of life was superior to that of the barbarians, heavy quotes, from surrounding lands. Somewhere on here, there's a note that lost freeholds might get a lot out of the courtly politics out of the time. And then there's this attention to how some of the many, many people who died in this era, because honestly, it's something like 2/3 of the population by the end of it had died. A lot of it was from cruelty or starvation or without proper burial rites, who then came back and came back pissed. There is a chunk of text on how there's this common knowledge in the culture surrounding ghosts and the underworld. Plus, there's the appearance of the not quite dead Jiangshi, all of which is solid, even if it's more relevant for a Geist game. The only thing in this whole historical overview that I think was maybe lacking for me a bit was a little bit of geographical detail and or maybe some examples of how to like literally describe a scene. But overall I thought it was pretty solid as like a grounding if you don't know anything about this period in history. Thoughts?
I do not have much context for the history of this period outside of this. With that in mind, I enjoyed the writing of it. I certainly felt like I understood the settings they were presenting it, and I had enough information to do something with it. I got excited about the idea of that homespun court game dealing with the politics behind the scene where you're not just deciding how much money you have, you're
Hmm.
deciding whether millions of people are going to be well fed or starving tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of weight. I got intrigued about the idea of something focused upon one of the major conflicts. We do not get enough information here to do very much with those. I feel that if you wanted to play out, like, say, the Battle of the Red Cliffs, you would be well advised to go read up a little bit more on that one before making that into your, 9 session adventure.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point about like those the import of those political decisions.
Oh, you hinted this, but I want to emphasize that they are careful to note that, hey, there were people who. I'm just going to read it. Not much has been written about the non-Chinese tribes that existed within and outside of the periphery of the Three Kingdoms. What has been stated is colored by the prejudices of the area. The historians of the time naturally saw themselves as superior to the people of the steppes. The more scholastic troop could potentially explore the ramifications of the oppression and how those tribes might have stood against the Three Kingdoms.
Hmm.
It might involve an independent freehold that has decided to defend against the invaders. Perhaps a Sun Eater band has grown exhausted of the conflict and, goaded by the concerns of the local spirits, has chosen to stand against an army. I appreciate the book taking a moment to acknowledge that.
Right on.
Something odd about this section on history and legend. We spend a lot of time talking about the history with snippets of the legends worked in, and then just kind of clumsily, I feel, this big section about the hungry dead, which then covers ghosts and animals, spirits, demons, minor deities. It gets into the true fae. It feels like something that should have been in the Geist and changing sections.
I did think about that. Well, the Fey part not so much, but like because as we talked about before, the distinction between ghosts and geists, and ghosts are solidly grounded in the base foundational Chronicles of Darkness setting, and it's really 3 lines put together, and the first one is the core setting. Like you could skip the Fey and Geist stuff and still run this as a Mortals game with those ghosts, and it would still be compelling.
That's a good theory, except they then spend a significant portion of the Geist chapter just talking about the Hungry Dead specifically, and
Well,
those are like
I didn't say it was perfect. But yeah, no, I agree. But I think that was the motivation, at least, for talking, for front loading so much of what they then also backloaded. But speaking of the Fae, after all of that summary, we come to the Courts of Chaos, where we find out what the Lost are up to here. Really a quite bleak opening, aside from pointing to the massive upheavals of mortal life in this time, which makes it easier for keepers to snag people, there's a good note that the hedge, being psychoactive, reflects all of these calamities, especially because they say thousands of changelings have burst back into the world because the world has messed the hedge up so bad.
the point about the war has changed things about the hedge did not make sense to me.
Hmm.
So the theory, at least from Changeling First Edition, is that what enables you to come back into the world is the sense of familiarity, time, place, or at least something sympathetic to what your lived experiences were. The problem with the era is that it's a war which is notably destroying everything that is familiar. If anything, this seems like it should be doing the very opposite and keeping changelings from finding a familiar foothold to return.
Well, okay, but then my question becomes, does the familiar foothold still have to exist, or is it purely a self-driven thing within the changeling? Because I could think of somebody who's like, oh, I remember my family very well, and you come back and they've been dead 100 years.
In first edition, the emphasis is yes, it needs to exist because the reason that very old changelings have a hard time coming back is that those literal anchors are gone.
So, do you think that this is a shift that was already happening? Because there is also another important shift that is kind of pointing more towards second edition that we'll see in a couple pages.
Yes, and it's good, and you should do that because it's much more fun to have somebody from 1,000 years ago wind up in modern era and just have to deal with it.
Mm,
Heck, take any cool character from this era, have them get kidnapped by the true Fae, show up in modern day, and that's almost literally an anime.
yeah. I think, though, I mean, points well taken. My sense is that what they were more trying to get at was just that the hedge being this barrier, it's a two-way thing. So, like, just the fraying of stability, because this is a very, remember also the mandate of heaven. You have this idea that right action is what keeps the wheels of the universe turning correctly. So, if all of that is spinning out of control, I think the implication they're going for is that even the hedge on this side starts to like fall apart a little bit. So changelings who are trying to get back, whatever the connection may be, it's just that the walls are fraying from the other side. Whether or not that jives with the presentation well in first edition, that's kind of what I was taking away from their write up here.
I agree with you. I think that is what they are going for.
Yeah. What I did not care for was which group of Lost supports which candidates among the three kingdoms. I was like, I could not care less about that level of politicking. I think the more abstract things you were pointing to, about the impact of decisions, that's what matters to me, not like, well, what if we support this state over this one? Anyway, we're back to talking about the directional courts as well, which we previously saw in Winter Masks, although they've added center as a fifth direction here. I don't think they directly said this is when the directional courts were started, but that was kind of the implication that I felt. There is a cool bit about how they meet in these freeholds within the hedge with doorways that have random destinations, which I really liked. And then also three really quick Fairfolk examples. Overall, the tone of this kind of presentation of the Lost, is this a kind of changeling the Lost that you would be into playing? Would you play this?
Yes, I like the idea of a group of Lost dealing with the politics of the era, being caught up in something horrifying and unavoidable. I like the concept that the mandate of heaven is having a supernatural effect
Mm.
that the weird is keying into. I think that the changelings recognizing that there is something supernatural going on there and that there is a story that they're going to get caught up in one way or the other creates a good opportunity for changelings to then go, well, if this is going to be the story of the world, and if we have no choice but to be written into the story, we might as well write ourselves in as heroes.
I agree. So, getting into the courts, we have the Court of the Black Tortoise, which is the northern court attuned to suffering. They labor under the delusion that the huntsman will cut them some slack because they're already being tortured back here on Earth. The Vermilion Bird, which is the southern court attuned to rebellion. Previously in Winter Masks, this was the Court of Ecstasy. They somehow feel that rebellion serves the mandate of heaven because it's a time of chaos, but also they're into like change and renewal, and being dirty is important to them. This is the one that most felt like to me that it didn't know where it was going. Like it could have gone in a trickster direction, but just didn't really lean into that. Because these are also short write-ups. We get like a few paragraphs and then a mantle write-up for each one. But
It is the one which leaves you to realize that what they actually do is inspire people to start rebellions.
I guess so, yeah.
Like all the others say what they actually are doing day to day. And for this one, it just says, and after the soldiers have cleared out, then they come in.
Yeah, but then it's also like they like offending people with their unwashed nature. And it's like, what does that have to do with anything? But I don't know. I think there was a lot that they were trying to cover in a short space that didn't quite land.
It is a little too short. A problem that will.
You know.
We talked about this before the recording. Both this and Requiem for Regina were written with one of the two splats predominant. In Regina, it's vampire. In this era, it's Geist. Geist gets a huge section in here, including a significant storyteller section. Changeling really doesn't.
Yeah, but I guess we'll take what we can get. Just to cover the rest of these, the Court of the Azure Serpent is the Eastern Court, attuned to envy, which somehow also serves the mandate of heaven. But envy is an interesting one because this is definitely a time of haves and have-nots in many different senses. And they ultimately come across as kind of assholes around that, which, I mean,
Yes.
one of the courts has to be an asshole court. The Court of the White Tiger is the Western court attuned to honor. They are frontline fighters and the most populous court. They believe that their aggression shields them from the huntsmen and are overall a pretty straightforward idea.
It doesn't actually shield them from the huntsmen, it's just that they murder so many huntsmen that they.
Yeah. And then the new one is the Court of the Yellow Dragon, the center court attuned to reflection. They mostly hang out with other changelings, kind of comforting and supporting them. Their focus on reflection is meant to spark epiphanies in others.
It's like the Blue Lantern ring from DC Comics, where it doesn't really do much by itself, but it makes all the other rings more powerful.
Yeah.
I thought it was a neat concept that they do that, but it also felt kind of like a fan concept to me. Like, these ones do stuff involving other changelings. Nobody's done that before, I guess, but I want stuff focused on humanity. This is ostensibly about the horrors of war, and if we're going to have an entire thing about reflection, maybe it should be a reflection on the war and the mandate of heaven.
Yeah, it definitely felt tacked on to Geist. I mean, to your point just then, like the actual opening section is so threadbare, and then we have 5 courts and some contracts, and it's like, okay, well, is that it? But I don't know if I remember them well enough from their Winter Masks presentation to see how I feel about these being the historical underpinnings for those other directional courts. They're definitely thinly sketched out here, but I want the takeaway to be here's how a court shifts over time to reflect the circumstances around them. I don't know that we really get enough to kind of see that.
And I feel like we could have gotten a lot more information about what the True Fae and the Hobgoblins were doing.
Hmm.
Like remember Victorian Lost, where a big theme is True Fae shows up and says, "Hey, you seem to be dying in the streets. How about I take you in for a while?" And then somebody comes to pick you out of your durance, and you go, it sucks here, but honestly, better than going back to whatever that is." I could see the same thing happening here. Imagine, if you will, an army is sweeping through an area for a supply raid because they are just fresh out. But every village they come to is already emptied.
Hmm.
The changelings that are with them are like, what the fuck is going on? They investigate and discover there's hedge portals. And when they go through them, they discover, oh wow, there are these massive trods leading right to Arcadia. These are the big ones. And one of the True Fae is hanging out on the road and says, "Oh, hello there. I don't want to fight you. All those people came with me voluntarily. Just want to let you know, if anybody else wants to come, open door invitation. You all have a great day. I'll see you later. I've got some people to go take care of now."
Yeah. Something I do like here, actually, this is totally unrelated, but I forget if this is a thing, that the second level of the mantle for each one is a goblin vow with their associated emotion. Is that a new thing here, or is that previous courts had that too?
It's a new thing. Now, Goblin Vow in first edition is a trick you can do where you make a deal with some aspect of reality yourself, and it lets you do like impromptu contract effects. This, however, is an example of this Changeling 1.5 thing we haven't really
Yeah,
explained. And this is something which will not, in fact, be explained in later books.
I like the concept though. I mean, I
Oh,
can
yeah,
I can run with that. That's because like if you take a goblin vow of reflection, that's mirror magic essentially.
yeah. I would love to have access to a whole extra realm of magic just by being associated with one of these. That said, maybe they dropped it because we already have a word for that, and it's your court's entire suite of contracts.
Well, right. So let's talk about that because we got contracts of the directional courts here with, I think, two mechanical innovations. First, I think this is the first time where we see that specific themings get bonuses, which become standard in second edition.
One of my favorite things.
Yeah, this is where it started. And then also two of these. So we have a couple contracts in the mix of the contracts of the directional courts, which are variable. So you can have a specific clause from 1 through 5. How does that even work?
I'm noticing that it's not just that. These appear to be worked out like merits. So we have a
Hmm.
1 dot, a 1 to 5 dot, a 3 dot. So I think the idea is that you could just pay whatever the experience cost is for the 3 dot contract and have nothing else. However, I think if you wanted shifting from center, you would need to pay for each level of it.
I suppose it's contracts to me always feel like a step by step, and that kind of, I don't know if I'm supposed to sidetrack or replace or like whatever, and it's not really.
I think in this case, you're supposed to just pick your favorites and
Yeah.
roll.
Well, so briefly, in order, these let you get a sense of direction towards the thing you desire, give others a die penalty by throwing them spiritually off balance, get a movement bonus, ward a place of rest, teleport through doors, and perceive fateful moments to come, tinted by the emotion of your court. It's kind of a scattershot assortment, which plays off the idea of like directions and heavy quotes. But I mean, like a couple of the courts, I kind of felt like it was struggling to unify around a single theme. Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't super into these.
I'm glad to finally see the seeming benefits show up.
Yes. No, I mean, the mechanical innovation, like that piece is great.
One of the later books, I think it's Changing Second Edition Core, has errata for all of these court mantles.
Aha.
I don't think they do a errata for the individual contracts, unfortunately, but the mantles get errataed so that you could update them properly to second edition.
Nice. So that's the changeling section, after which there's a bunch more Geist stuff, which, as you pointed out, I thought we were done with this. But yeah, like I do think some of this, I just kind of skimmed this section. It would be variably useful if you ran a Lost Chronicle set here. So, for example, those notes about how the common folk know a lot about ghosts, hungry ghosts in particular, that comes back here, and it helps you understand the context surrounding a story you may want to run where changelings are interacting with ghosts, geists, sin eaters, etc. On the off chance your players go to the underworld, there are specific features described here that are grounded in Chinese mythology. We have foes also like the Yama Kings. The way that sin eaters or Wuchangui integrate into the culture with like the ghost festival and things like that, especially in the midst of all of this death, that's useful. We talked in our Geist episode about how much do the Lost really know about sin eaters and vice versa. And even if the answer is not much, this section points to the common social and narrative ground that you can find between them. Both groups can understand something like a massacre or a famine, even if their role relative to that event and how they interpret its cause will differ. I think that's a good lesson for any time period. But beyond that, I mean, I'm not really interested in getting into like the rules updates for Geistir or the politics of this corner of the underworld, etc. So, is there anything from this section that stood out to you that's relevant for a changeling game?
Relevant for a changeling game specifically.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you my favorite parts and if I remember anything changing related, because I feel like there was at least one piece that'll come to mind here shortly. Then I'll bring that up. First off, is you mentioned that the Yama Kings are antagonists, and yes, you can go force the Yama Kings to get back to doing their jobs. That's one of the coolest things I have ever heard of characters getting to do in any Role of Darkness game. There is a curious ritual for the Sin Eaters in this one. Normally, the bargain is a accident on the mortal's behalf. You die, you don't want to pass away, a ghost shows up and says, let's make a deal, you agree, and boom, you come back. In this book, instead, some exorcists, some of them know a ritual where you can do a form of a ritual suicide that is designed to summon a ghost very specifically to be bound so that you can become a sin eater. It does not often work, so you are certainly making a heroic choice by doing so, but people do it because things are so tough that they're willing to take that risk in exchange for the power they need to save the world.
I totally missed that, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Dying for Power, page 134.
Noted.
I highly recommend that you also read the section What Hungry Ghosts Are Like. These are a main feature of what people deal with in Geist. The idea being that because people no longer are around to propitiate their ancestors, those same ancestors, which do spend most of their time in the underworld but can come out of it, become hungry ghosts, and the only people who can deal with them are oftentimes going to be the sin eaters. Surprisingly thorough and detailed.
And like I've said before, this is not Geist the podcast, but there is a thorough storytelling section if you do want to run a solid Geist game. I was impressed by how much there was in here.
Absolutely. And I think the information about being settled bands or nomadic exorcists is worth reading even as a
Mm.
changeling storyteller, because it gets into the idea of what people will experience if they are traveling around or if they're stuck in one location. Most notably, I'd say that if you decided to play a group of changelings that settled in one town and decided, we're going to like manage the bureaucracy here, and we're going to make sure that justice is still being served, that people are being fed, that the bureaucrats aren't taking advantage of people. By doing that, you're going to attract more people, including refugees and also warlords who go, man, this town seems like it's doing really good for itself. Maybe I should settle in here. And then you have a whole story about where your changing freehold is going to have to ride out with some fairy knights to go take on a warlord. Or you know what? Yes, you should do a game about fairy knights repelling a warlord, and you should absolutely have an arc where the changelings have to go into the hedge and recruit a hobgoblin army to help support their refugees.
Beautiful. So overall, I guess I was expecting more crossover because there wasn't really a lot of direct crossover. And clearly, it wasn't a lost adventure like in the back half because the Fae didn't get much mention beyond like, oh yeah, by the way, here are these courts. The descriptions felt like here's what might come up if you need to craft the barest amount of motivation or exposition for an NPC Fae in an otherwise Sin Eater focused game. Throw in their court and the relevant emotion, and at least that gives your character a hook to hang off of. If you do run a Fae-centric game here, I think your note about the storytelling context or the storytelling section is useful, but I think it's a lot more work for a changeling storyteller than a Geist storyteller, or even if you're running a mixed game. You can make it work, but it's you who have to make it work, I guess is my takeaway.
Look, Book, I hate to agree with you on this one. I got
Why?
Well, because I love changeling. Look, I got excited about this era because I liked all of the Geist content. The idea that your primary antagonist could be a necromancer who decided, forget all this exorcist stuff. I can resurrect literally millions of people and form an army of the dead to serve me is quite the premise for an adventure. And it served as, I think, the first really strong example of action horror that I
Hmm.
dug into. There were ones before this, like Dogs of War and, of course, the Armory books. This is the one that always stuck with me for that one. The changing stuff always felt like it was an appendix, and now I understand why, because it kind of is, unfortunately, to that one. And nevertheless, Puka, I know I expressed enthusiasm at the beginning, but those story hooks I came up with were off the top of my head. I clearly feeling something by what little I've read and remember from this book already. So
Well,
I guess it did its job for me. I can run Changeling the Lost for this era based entirely upon what it told me and your prompting.
Awesome. So now we move on to Requiem for Regina. Something I didn't do at the start, which I want to do now, is mention who wrote Three Kingdoms of Darkness, because, credit where credit's due. That one was by Eloy La Santa, Cassandra Ho, and John Sneed. Good on them. Requiem for Regina, by contrast, is by Rose Bailey, Anna Loy, Renee Ritchie, and Audrey Whitman. Now that that's sorted, let's talk about Shakespeare. Or actually, not really. But being a Shakespeare nerd and a vampire player before I did anything else in the World of Darkness, I was stoked to get into this one, and I feel like I was setting myself up for disappointment.
Pooka, I gotta be upfront with you. I went into this knowing nothing about this era, including that it was the Shakespeare era. I only realized that like the moment they bring up his name.
Well, I'm here to learn some Shakespeare history at people, so I must also say, we have this header that says Requiem for Regina, 1593, and then the first sentence says 1587, which was like an immediate turn off to me. Anyway, the opening narration here makes it clear that we're looking at the grittiest expression of the Elizabethan age. Filth in the streets and fleas in the sheets. There's lots of blood spilled for religion in this era, lots of political intrigues, paranoia galore. Something that I've had cause to think about before in various projects, and when we talked about Victorian Lost, I probably brought this up, but the idea of the city as an iconic space. When you have a specific city that kind of defines what the word city means in the regional or global consciousness. New York has a lot of that energy, but so does London, and London has had that for longer. So, as historical European settings go, London is probably one of the most cosmopolitan and therefore can be one of the most familiar to people. So, you don't have to really explain how the city works so much to the players. You just have to emphasize details and differences and which things matter most. The theme we get in this one is schisms, where bonds once thought impossible to break have turned to enmity. The mood is someone's watching, which is fitting for an era that really saw the dawn of spycraft and, as they say, the budding police state. Both are very thinly described, but that environment where kind of everyone is in each other's unwashed business and superstition and suspicion are rampant, it makes for good vampire material and good changeling material, in my opinion. So, like we said with Three Kingdoms, what were your expectations going into this?
Okay, now this one I can talk expectations. Well, I thought, oh, we're gonna get into a lot about paranoia for living in this era. I didn't really feel that much of it by the end. So
No. Well, sometimes it's good to have expectations dashed. That is the Fey way. So, up front, we get a lot of history. Like, a lot. Like, a quarter of this module, just history for the vampire section.
a lot of this history seemed like it was pulling names out of a hat of historical figures. Am I right about that?
I wouldn't say out of a hat, but it does, I would say, take a scope that's much larger than necessary. We go all the way from the Roman era to, we actually go past the Elizabethan era because there's like a future fates kind of thing. But yeah, most of this I would say was unnecessary even for the vampire game, unless your vampire game is one that is like, I'm 1,000 years old and I remember the entirety of the Saxon era. So I think the only really relevant stuff in here is that there is a covenant called the Waihankin, who are spoopy and mystical vampires in the wilderness. There's a contingent that wants to bring back the glory of Rome and the Camarilla, which we talked about in our vampire episode. And Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham, masterfully played by Geoffrey Rush in the film Elizabeth, is about to die. But then there's like so much more. Except I did like the bit about how vampires are no longer allowed to kill anyone on stage at a Shakespeare play after an unfortunate frenzy during the premiere of Titus Andronicus. That was fun.
What was that about? Is that based on something historical?
I don't know if it's based on something historical, but Titus Andronicus is a famously bloody play, so it was just kind of funny to me. But yeah. The section afterwards, though, is rather useful because it describes everyday life in London in the late 1580s. So you've got notes about things like the popularity of taverns and the ubiquity of music, regular occurrences of the plague are still a thing. There's an increasing divide between the rural and the urban, like we saw again in Victorian Lost, and the urban life, at least. There's kind of everyday violence, including sports like bear baiting. There's tension between Catholics and Protestants and the rise of atheism. All of it is rich material, plus you have Elizabethan drama as a ready-made literary source for inspiration.
I would have thought that we would get a similar section to Victorian laws in here, at risk of them repeating themselves, about, again, the true Fae coming in and how they would take advantage of this situation, because the paranoia is real bad. But I don't think they get into that at all.
They don't, and it's a shame because unlike in the Three Kingdoms book, there's not a general historical overview before breaking into the two game lines. There's like a lot of history in each of them. So there's like a lot of history in the vampire section and a lot of history in the changeling section, some of which repeats itself, but not all.
I think all of the general history stuff is in the vampire section and very vampire focused. If you want to read about what the era was like, you have to read the vampire section and deal with that, which I do not think was a good move. I think they should have done it like Three Kingdoms of Darkness, where they have a neutral mortal recounting, and then they could have taken those sections to dig into what the supernaturals were doing.
My guess is that they probably assumed, whether or not they should have, that like people would just think of Shakespeare and run with that. But yeah. So mixed in with the vampire stuff, like having done our coverage of Requiem, I do recognize some of the names, and sure, for the deep cuts, I could look at the wiki to find out what is the Icarian heresy, or why are the Invictus splitting along lines of birthright versus material wealth. But it's not really useful to my purpose as a changeling storyteller. I really prefer the kind of surprising bits that come out of the social everyday life stuff, because that gives you tidbits you can drop into the setting to make it feel lived in. Different, but lived in. Was there anything that surprised or intrigued you from that? Like, I don't know if you're a scholar of Elizabethan history, but
You know I'm not. I told you
yes,
repeatedly that I know.
anything from that London Tonight that you're like, oh, I didn't know people did X.
Uh, First off, I did not realize just how on the outs the Catholics were at this time. I did not know how much the oppression was like that. I did not know how paranoid the era was. I'm like thinking this is 1500s. I didn't know that was a thing that was even possible to maintain that kind of police state.
Just for context, it's really against the backdrop of the Protestant Reformation, because you had
Oh.
Henry VIII breaking away from the church, and then Elizabeth, his daughter. So Henry VIII broke away from the church. Edward, his son, maintained that until he died young. Mary, Henry's daughter, kind of dragged everyone back to Catholicism, which included burning hundreds of heretics, which is why she's known as Bloody Mary. And then Elizabeth, following her, tried to like steer this middle course. The famous sort of line is where she's like, I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. Faith should be a private matter, which was, to the Catholics, heretical. So there were these plots throughout her reign to like assassinate her or push her off the throne and put a Catholic back on. Because England, Protestantism had kind of blossomed in the German speaking area, but that was all like little tiny principalities and everything. England was like the first big kingdom where they fully threw off the church. And so it was a big deal. This was also the era when cryptography was kind of invented, modern cryptography. So the notes about Walsingham being the spy master and like developing the spy network, he was one of the first in the modern era to like really kind of make that a thing. There's a lot to unpack here.
I thought that the middle class had more power and influence by this point.
Yeah, well, the merchant class, yeah.
I thought that this was past the point where the nobles had all the wealth, but this makes it sound like that was still very much the case. They were.
Well, there was kind of like an old money, new money thing going on, because this was also when colonialism was taking off. So there's a lot of moving pieces obviously that cannot be compressed into a single dark era module.
Could have been good
But yeah,
inspiration for like a changeling thing, right? Because
yeah,
the Fae are traditionally aristocratic and they want things to stay the way that they are. The idea of a up and coming, God, this is something they could have done, right? Like they could have done stories about like the up and coming uprising of like the middle class or the lower classes, or even the maybe the tensions in faith. But they don't really get into that for the changeling material here.
yeah. This is why I have said repeatedly that if they had ever done a historical setting for Changeling the Dreaming, it should have been the Elizabethan. because there's like just so much going on. I mean, we haven't even talked about the theater culture, but like this is the era of Shakespeare and all of that. I would say for anyone who goes into these dark eras and needs to do historical reading, like this is the one where I would say do as much as possible because like there's just so much to unpack here. Anyway, vampire. So aside from all of that, we get some more vampire specific stuff. We learn that the kindred have this sort of neutral messenger service / highwayman association called the Gallows Post, some of whom may be as responsible for on-the-road mortal disappearances as the keepers are. We read that some Invictus desire a new Camarilla, especially as the colonization across the Atlantic gathers steam, or gathers sail, actually. We're not in the steam era yet. The Lancia et Sanctum seem to be wrestling with crises of faith in parallel with the fractures in the church, as hinted by that theme of schisms. And the Wei-Han-kun, despite being a pagan remnant, are the most powerful covenant in London. They are ruled by Yeldra Atilgifu, whose name I love saying. For a crossover connection, they have the merit Contract with the Uncanny, by which they can call on favors from a supernatural group, such as the Fae. So that's pretty cool. And then there's a whole mess of characters, some of whom I think I'd find interesting in a vampire game, others of whom I don't think I'd even use in that case. Any favorite characters?
No. I found my eyes scrolling off of these characters very. You know what? I did actually enjoy Felix posing as Lord Francis
Yes.
Walsingham.
He was my favorite. Yadra and Felix were my two favorites, yeah.
Ildra is also, if I had to pick a second, it would be her because she's like super involved in the supernatural, right? Like that's her whole thing, I think.
Yeah, and who doesn't love an ancient Saxon witch queen princess?
I was surprised to learn that she was the one who's in charge of it because when I read everything else, it was so into the Link at Sanctum and the Invictus that I assumed there was an Link at Sanctum archbishop ruling the city. I did not realize that was not the case at all.
My sense, because we do get that archbishop, that's Cadman, I get the sense that what they're pointing towards is the Lancia et Sanctum is not the most powerful because they're kind of split along these lines, and the Invictus is not the most powerful because they're split along their lines. And the Wei-Han-kun is like, guess what? We've been here 1,500 years, and they are entrenched, so it's about breaking their power. They will, presumably, eventually fall from power as the other two groups kind of right themselves and as London modernizes further. But maybe you could see this as the last gasp of that local covenant.
I do love the bit about the Link at Sanctum at this point is struggling with the idea of there being rifts in their faith that they are so fractured they cannot begin to clean up the city when they can't clean up their own house.
Yeah. I did also like how we got a few mortals in the mix here, both pawns and accomplices, because that gives you more vectors of story to explore. So I thought that was a good move.
Yes, what a surprise that was.
Yeah. And speaking of story, the section ends with a few options, each of which gives a brief overview, an opening scene, and a few key scenes that spin off from there. 3 of them involve an outbreak of plague, the death of noted queer playwright and probable spy Christopher Marlowe, and something faith and vampires. But one of them involves a Fae Queen calling in a pact, demanding the return of some mysterious capital T trophy, else all the vampires of London will die. For added complication, the trophy is long since lost, its nature forgotten by even the elder vampires. It might be hidden in a random tiny street. It might be a weird eternal street child, or both. I dug this.
I love it too. I love that this does not need to be one of the true Fae. It can just be whoever's currently ruling the Changeling Courts steps in and says, y'all owe me this. And the vampires go, oh, I guess they can remember things.
And the great thing, to your point just then, the great thing is that having the Fae show up the vampires about their own immortality, and like when we talked about Torpor in the vampire episode, their immortal memories are not nearly as infallible as they think. That's a great angle for crossover. As well as, the Invictus are all about oaths, and here's this Fae Queen that's like, hold my ale. Imagine how much fun it would be to do this in any setting. Like, you could easily have this in modern times. And I'm glad that they included a proper crossover option, which we didn't get in the Three Kingdoms one. So everything about this I was into.
Should have done more with it. They should have
Yeah.
done more with it.
And so anything else from the vampire stuff before we move on?
I'm good.
All right. So the changeling section is thinner for sure, but
Eh.
there is still some meat here, as this is one of the longer dark eras in the book. We open with a history section again that moves much more briskly and is more focused on the Fae from the start. There are notes about how Britain has always been close to Arcadia and historically has been a hotbed for developing new courts. The Hundred Years' War and Wars of the Roses get some coverage here to help explain how the courts we'll see later in this section aligned with the political factions and to point to how changelings were involved. Sidebar, I love the note that Henry VI's mental breakdown was the result of seeing a Fae mean. That's the kind of supernatural historical revisionism I can live with.
Oh, what's the deal with that? I have no idea.
He had a mental breakdown.
No, that's
And
it.
when
Okay.
the king has a mental breakdown, which has happened regularly in the history of both England and France, it's not great.
Oh, they do terrible things in the throw of power rather than just being consigned to a room.
I mean, kind of both.
Oh.
So,
There's a piece I love at the beginning of this. Ironically, in Changing the Lost, Christians breaking the traditional belief systems and thereby the rituals that people observed in their day to day life increased Fey influence instead of diminishing it.
I have to be honest, that sort of association, like the tension between the courts and the fracturing of religion, I don't know. I felt like it was kind of not well supported, but I rolled with it.
Why do you say that? Do you think that was just like the wrong era, or do you think that's just not a
No,
accurate
well,
recording of like how the religions shifted over time?
no, I think it's fine to point to that as how the religion shifted, but with the exception of when they're talking about the rise in atheism, each of those sort of religious groups that fractured did have robust rituals that they leaned into hard. And so I think they say capital F, capital W, Fey War that comes out of that. Um, it's not that people were abandoning rituals, it's that they were finding new ones and really taking them on that allowed, I guess, the influence to kind of ramp up. And there's a comment to be made in there somehow. I'm trying to like figure I just didn't feel like it gave me enough of an explanation for why that was the result. But yeah, I mean, I'm fine with it.
What about the rest of the section?
Yeah, so we move on to talk about Gloriana's London, where we get more information really about changing the life than mortal. So, like you said, you kind of have to pair it with what's in the vampire section. But there's a couple interesting angles to explore here, which I think you could use to kind of twist a player's arc. One thing they point to is how women living alone are vulnerable to gossip, especially about witchcraft. Like, look at those sort of notes and think about how they might impact a changeling's mortal presentation to the world around them. And skipping around a bit, just kind of before we get into the court stuff, there's a few places in the city that got called out, which are really fun. There's a standing stone gate to Arcadia called the Lodenstein, which is sealed with iron and just kind of like smack dab in the middle of a street in the city.
Love that one.
There's the Royal Exchange, which is the site of the greatest goblin market in London, and the Cheapside House, which is where the king holds his court. I don't know that we needed all of the paragraphs after that about future fate stuff, which is like the courts shift, colonialism spreads, the Little Ice Age arrives, but
We also didn't need them to repeat the court's personalities
yeah.
and structure twice, three times, maybe. This could have been an email. That said, I must say that my favorite personality in this is definitely Nicholas the Red, because he just feels kind of like a guy.
An Elizabethan dude, bro.
Ruby Jewel Eyes Ogre. What
Yeah.
a person.
Now that we've broached the subject, let's talk about these courts. So we have the Blood Court, the Snow Court, and the Ash Court. Some fairy tale Snow White vibes going on there, led by Nicholas the Red, Ambrose White, and the Black Queen, respectively. The Blood and Snow Courts arose from the red and white rose symbolism of Lancaster and York in the Wars of the Roses, while the Ash Court tried to remain neutral. They supplanted the seasonal courts during those wars and have stepped into the rulership of London, but now they too are constantly fighting, although they've traded proper warfare for like duels and jousts and arcane battles, which made me think of contract duels. So that was cool. The Court of Blood is attuned to joy. They're the proud and exuberant ones with wealth and beauty and passion. They have a contract of inspiration. Again, these are all kind of a single power ranked 1 through 5, so they're kind of merits in contract clothing. That one grants various conditions. The Court of Snow is attuned to resolve, whatever that might look like. They represent the common folk and are more egalitarian, but they're kind of order on the surface, chaos underneath, despite the power and influence they hold. Their contract of abjuration lets them dispel other contracts. Each dot then gives them additional powers to dispel the powers of other supernaturals. So very crossover applicable.
That's an incredibly good contract.
It's my favorite out of all of these. Well, no, I take that back, actually. I think I actually like the ones for the Court of Ash even more. So the Court of Ash is attuned to hope, which is interesting. They're often the scapegoat for the other two, but they make many allies, including among supernaturals, and have more power than even they might realize. Mostly they're expected to survive and stand united, and they actively recruit to that end. Their contracts of air and darkness let them make illusions, and each dot kind of adds a quirk to the illusions you can create. So I like them because they're subtle in their power and thoughtful in its execution. And that's the kind of vibe that I like to go for here. I mean, they're basically the autumn variant, I would say. But all three, I mean, compared with the directional chords, I felt like these, I had more I could grab onto because it's more than just in the context of war, here's how they behave. You get a lot more dynamics kind of under the surface, I would say.
I honestly couldn't tell the difference between the Ash and the Snow Court in the sense of who they supposedly take. I thought both of them sounded like they take the lower class.
It does say that Snow and Ash are allied, so maybe it's just kind of a difference in, I don't know, perspective or something.
I'd love to talk about this section of playing the game because we get a really cool magic item in here.
Yes. So we get a few scenes, as in Three Kingdoms. Again, there's a plague one, in this case, maybe from an incubus rather than just microbes. And there's a seventh son of a seventh son who's arrived in the city, can see the Fae, and has made it his mission to get rid of them. But with this magic item, yes, the relevant story is that there's a courtless knight who arrives and seeks to unite the courts into a new Camelot. So how might that magic item help?
Excalibur's Scabbard. I'm going to read this to our audience directly. It's a tasty treat. This has no assigned dot rating, the reason for which will become quickly apparent. The scabbard is a subtle creation. It has no obvious magical properties, and it appears to be well worn and water stained. It provides its bearer two benefits: iron stamina at 3 dots, as well as a single extra point of health. This point is physically separate from the health boxes of the bearer. It cannot be filled by damage done to the changeling, only damage done to the scabbard itself. So far, all this is good, but it's the last line that's the real kicker. As long as a character has the scabbard, he cannot die or be knocked unconscious. Delicious.
I mean, it's just a level 3 treasure in dreaming as well.
Oh, you.
Well, I'm glad that Excalibur's scabbard is seeing kind of more play in the fandom, because it's always been part of the lore, but people are like, Excalibur! And I'm like, I'll take the scabbard any day of the week.
Well, good news is you don't have to pick. If you grab Dark Eras 2, you can go to the King Arthur era and grab the sword as well.
Perfect. So my follow-up question to this was, would you use any of these stories? It sounds like the Camelot one might be kind of... Although this one, the Camelot one, is rather similar to the one we had with somebody setting up their own little kingdom on the edge of the hedge and everybody being like, what's this guy up to? Why is he building a private army?
I wouldn't use these stories. I'm not really interested in them, but I would absolutely grab that scabbard and toss it on an NPC and say, this person has that, isn't that cool? And then
There you
the
go.
would go, yeah, all right.
Cool scabbard, bro.
Pooka, in all seriousness, I have done cool sword bro, and players seem to enjoy that in moderation. Just make sure that you give them cool things too, and they'll appreciate your NPCs who also have their own cool things. Or give it to your players. Throw it in as an item. It's fun.
So on that note, we end the section. It kind of ends abruptly. Thoughts overall?
I think that I would have had more fun with this if I was sitting down with you and some other folks who know the era, and you just started telling me about like spy masters and theater stuff, and then brought in what you thought you could do with supernatural stuff, and then I would have gotten, oh, that sounds really cool. That would have been a much more engaging way for me to find this than reading through what felt like a very enthusiastic, if not particularly compelling, reading of an era that I do not have a pre-existing interest in. I would not have guessed that these three changeling courts would have come into existence. I think the idea is neat, even if I'll be honest, I don't really understand how these three courts do their rotation of power.
Yeah.
It's both not clear to me from a what's the balancing act here, and also from a how do they actually do their transfer. Their powers are cool. The idea that the vampire sorceress queen is dealing with various supernatural beings is neat. The fairy queen story is fun. Lots of good bits here that I think I would use if I were running a Regency era game about changelings or vampires. But the section just failed to do the important thing of getting me to want to play that era in the first place.
I mean, I was honestly surprised by how little the actual court of Elizabeth was involved. Like, the name of the chapter made me think it would be kind of a pun, like, how do the supernaturals deal with her death? And there are allusions to the intrigues, but just not much direct engagement with the setting itself in the sample stories. I mean, there's a mess of history, but it really just seems like it's there to justify throwing some new splat options into the mix for both vampire and changeling. And I don't know, obviously you need a balance between that mundane history and the overtly supernatural stuff your players will engage with. I just don't know that this module hit the mark. The story with the trophy was a good point of direct crossover. The plague story hook could become one, but there's so much more that they didn't touch on. You could have Faye involved in the really bloody theater of the time. You could have the fight with the Spanish Armada. You could have John Dee, the court astrologer, turning up. You could dig into that cosmopolitanism that I was talking about and just have all the courts and kits that the players could meet in this city. They could be privateers. You could crack open the fabulous novel Midnight Never Come by Marie Brennan and throw diabolism into the mix. I know I'm nerding out about this period and all of this stuff within it, but there's so many more sensible directions they probably could have gone in. And I mean, I agree with what you say that, like, I don't see the logic of a lot of what they did present. I didn't hate it. And I mean, this is for both Requiem for Regina and for the Three Kingdoms of Darkness. There are specific bits that I appreciated, but I think in different ways, each of them from a Changeling the Lost perspective was a bit of a letdown for me.
Agreed. For audience members who are looking for opportunities to involve some of these other stories that Pooka was curious about, or other supernatural beings, every one of the Dark Eras includes a sidebar called The Chronicles of Darkness. It explains what the other supernatural beings are up to. It's just a few sentences for each because they're not the focus for that chapter. But if you want a little bit more on like what are the Awakened doing in Elizabethan London, they have an idea for you.
Yeah. Anything else before we wrap this thing up?
We're good. We're good.
Well, if you too have thoughts and feelings about history, well, okay, maybe not about history, about historical gaming, historical settings, you can share them with us or ask us questions in spaces such as our Discord at discord.me/CTP. You can send us an email at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. Check us out on Facebook or YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. We have a Mastodon, changelingpod at dice.camp, and you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of which will be in the show notes to this episode. So once again, I am the courtier known as Pooka.
What on earth does that leave me to be?
Do you want to be Hungry Dead for this one?
I'm the hungry dead known as Fetch. Sure.
Perfect. To game or not to game? That is the question. The historical settings chosen for Dark Eras tend to be ones where moral quandaries crystallize in the context of an unfamiliar time and place, with aspects that play into themes for each Chronicles of Darkness gameline in curious ways. When sorting through options for the book's shortlist, naturally there were many that almost but not quite made the cut, which were relegated onto the backup list of dimly lit epics. Among the settings that ended up on this less known list were 2nd century Pannonia for a Promethean and mage farming simulator, medieval Arabia for Mummy, wherein the protagonists chase ultimately unfounded rumors of corpses being preserved in honey, and the suburban US in the 1980s for a vampire Geist mashup sitcom. We're able to dredge up these and other forgotten development ideas through a combination of gumption, trickery, and the support of our patrons, whom we would like to shout out for their support. 100,000 thanks to Bad Company, Ben the Canadian, Siglosson Jr., Derek, Dorcadus, Elris, Henry Craft, Eobel, Oreo, Raskaboos, Rebecca P., Sandchigger, Sija, The Crew of Erebus, and Ware Buffalo. If you'd also like to help us keep the show going and get a shout out of your own, please consider signing up at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. We also appreciate reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. And you can always tell your friends and fellow hungry dead about us. Until next time, make sure you do right by the dead with your rituals, and try your best to keep all the blood off stage as you drift from place to place, time frame to time frame, all while you keep on dreaming.